Maybe that happened to you before, maybe not. The situation is that you pull your starter out of the fridge and it doesn't look great. It smells funny, there's a weird brownish, blackish liquid on top, and you're probably wondering if maybe you've just killed it. Well, I'm here to tell you, you probably didn't. This exact starter actually sat in my fridge for over a month now, and I'm going to show you exactly, step by step, my process, how I revive it, because I'm actually planning to bake some bread tomorrow, so I would really like to get it up to speed by tomorrow. I'm also going to talk about why this liquid is actually beneficial for your starter, why you should probably pour it off regardless of the advice you hear on the internet, and basically the fast track to revive it to bake as soon as possible.
As you can see, my starter looks very neglected, and the first thing I'm going to do is pour off the hooch. There are different opinions about this online, and since I take a very simple approach to sourdough, a lot of people probably expect me to say, oh, just stir it in, don't overthink it. But I think pouring off the hooch is such a simple step, and it makes a big difference in how your starter recovers. I'll talk more about that later, and we're going to touch on why, in case of reviving old starters, I just discard the majority of it first. But now let's focus on what I'm actually doing here. So step 1 is I poured off the hooch. Step 2 is I poured out almost all of the starter, leaving just a little at the bottom. And there's a reason for it, which I'm going to go into in a second. Just to be clear, I'm not going to give you exact measurements here. Your flour might be different than mine, your starter might be different, so there's no point in me telling you exact grams. What matters is consistency, which I'm showing you right here. Your starter should be thick enough to almost not slide off of a spoon. I think that's the best way to describe it. I'm sorry if it's not really very technical. Next, you only need to add a little water, I'd say just slightly more than the small amount of starter you have left in the jar. After that, you continue with feeding it enough flour to get your preferred consistency, and we're going to transfer everything to a new jar because the old one is probably all dirty and crusty. Don't be confused by the footage of me making some kind of dough here. I'm just trying to give you something a little more interesting to watch while I explain in more detail why we did what we did up to this point. And spoiler alert, I'm making sourdough discard bagels because that's a recipe I like to use when my starter is on the sour side, but not as neglected as the one we started with. I'll also explain why we took steps 1, 2, and 3 specifically. So why I poured off the hooch, why I left just a little starter in the jar and discarded the rest, why I fed it at roughly a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio or slightly higher, and why I made it thicker rather than thinner in consistency. First, let's address that portion of the starter that I discarded after pouring off the hooch. If your discard is only 2 or 3 weeks old, you can use it in any discard recipe. I'd lean more towards savory or bread recipes rather than sweet ones. There's still going to be a definite sour note that will come through. At least I like my discard really fresh for sweet bakes, but I don't mind the sour flavor as much in bread or savory bakes. But if your discard has been in the fridge for more than a couple of weeks, it's very sour and the gluten structure is virtually gone, and that's part of the reason why it appears so liquidy. Could you use it for crackers? Maybe, but I'm not opposed to throwing away a few tablespoons of flour when it's gotten this neglected. It doesn't happen often, so when it does, I don't feel like making something subpar just to save a bit of flour. Fun fact, yeast tends to sit lower in the jar, so when you're trying to revive a starter, it's good to keep that bottom bit. This is why just pouring the majority of starter out of the jar before mixing everything and disturbing that is actually a great way to start reviving. Let's talk a bit more about why you'll want to pour the hooch off. When reviving starters, I've done it both ways, and stirring the hooch back always gave me worse results. Hooch is basically alcohol. It's a byproduct of the starter's activity, and alcohol actually slows down yeast. It's like splashing a bit of vodka into your starter and then expecting it to thrive. Yeast doesn't really like that, so recovery takes longer that way, and that's why I believe it's worth the tiny extra step to pour it off. You might be wondering why we didn't feed the starter with a lot of flour and water, since that's usually the go-to method for balancing acidity. And the reason is simple. The cultures left are weak and starved. If you overwhelm them with too much flour and water, they'll take forever to wake up. I've made that mistake before, so I found that a modified ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 works a lot better. And that means adding about the same amount of water as the starter left in the jar, maybe just a bit more, and then adding the same amount of flour as well, and finally topping off with a little extra flour to make it thicker. So realistically, it ends up closer to, let's say, 1 to 1.2 to 1.9, if that makes sense. You want to start with a bit thicker consistency because that will help knock some of the acidity out, and it will give the yeast a good environment to recover. Now that the bagels are finished, let's go back to my recovering starter. After feeding it the first time, I waited for it to double in volume. Timing will vary depending on how active your starter is and how warm your kitchen is, but expect it to take somewhere around, I would say, 12 to 24 hours. Maybe it will even triple if it's really happy, but at the very least, you want it to double before the next step. And here I'm showing you my starter in the late evening on the same day, so about 15 hours after the first feeding. It didn't yet double, so I went to bed and came back to it in the morning when it was obviously already past its peak and just started to fall down, but it was visible that it did double, and that's the important part. After that happens, you can just feed it the second time as soon as you can. This second feeding will be very similar to the first one. We're going to start by discarding almost everything from the jar again. This time though, the starter isn't as sour anymore. It's relatively fresh, but still not fully recovered. So there's a bit of acidity still. But you could use it in something savory like the discard bagels I showed you before, or any bread recipe really. After discarding, we'll feed it again with flour and water, but this time we'll increase the amounts. We'll add more water than the starter we have left in the jar, and then enough flour to get that slightly thicker consistency that we want. This is the second and final recovery feeding, and I still recommend keeping it on the thicker side. If you plan to bake with the starter, just keep in mind the consistency. But honestly, I don't change my recipe measurements even if my starter is a little thicker or thinner. The starter usually makes up less than 20% of the total dough, so a small variation shouldn't make much of a difference. Once fed, mix everything together and let it double in volume again. Since this was a morning feed, I expected it to be ready by evening, so that means in about 12 hours or so, and it was. By the evening, the starter not only doubled but almost tripled in size. So, just to sum up for a bit of clarity, because I understand it can get confusing, I started the recovery process the day before in the morning with the first recovery feeding. By that evening, my starter still hasn't doubled, so I just left it overnight. Then the next morning, I gave it the second recovery feeding. By the way, if your starter does manage to double by the evening on the first day, so after the first recovery feeding, you can go ahead and do the second feeding then, so in the evening, but mine just needed a bit more time, and honestly, I think yours will as well, especially if it has been more than 1 month. After that second recovery feeding in the morning, by the evening, my starter had not only doubled but tripled in size, so I decided I was ready to bake with. I went ahead and mixed up my usual everyday sourdough dough, only did one round of stretch and fold because it was bedtime and I was really tired. And yes, that does change the texture of bread a little, but the bread still turned out great. You'll see the crumb at the end of this video, it's still beautiful. If you're more precise about sourdough, you can take it a step further. So in the evening, once your starter has doubled or tripled after the second recovery feeding, you can discard most of it and give it a normal feed before bed using your normal ratios, so not making it thicker. Then by morning, you'll have a strong, active starter that's ready to bake with. I'll have a Google Doc linked in the comments below with the condensed instructions for reviving your starter. I won't be asking for your email or anything. You don't have to sign up for anything. It's literally just a Google Doc for you to copy and paste the instructions from in case you need them. I know this video was a bit chatty, but I really wanted to share the why behind everything I do to revive the starter. Because once you understand that, it suddenly becomes so much more flexible because you know what's essential and what you can skip depending on the specific situation. If you want to go deeper, I also have a sourdough course called Everyday Sourdough, where I teach you how to bake sourdough on any schedule by really understanding it. I cover my 4 core doughs, the ones I use 95% of the time because they're so flexible. So go check out the description box for more info on that. And I also have a free sourdough masterclass when I show you how I make this exact bread I'm making here step by step. It's my easiest, most beginner-friendly sourdough loaf, so if you're planning to revive your starter and then bake something simple and foolproof, that's the one I'd start with. Again, you'll find the link in the description below. Please give this video a like if it helped you and subscribe if you want to see more, whether that's sourdough baking, homemaking, or just a bit of a slower life here in Slovenia. I do hope to see you next week. Bye!